The North Sea was a canvas of gray waves and mist on the afternoon of May 31st, 1916. It was here that the greatest concentration of naval firepower the world had ever seen began to converge. The horizon was obscured by the thick black smoke of hundreds of coal-fired engines pushing steel hulls through the cold water. Tensions were at a breaking point as the two most powerful fleets on Earth sought to destroy one another. The silence of the open ocean was about to be shattered by the thunder of heavy artillery. This was the moment the world had waited for since the war began. It was the clash of dreadnoughts that would shake the foundations of naval warfare forever. For years, the British Empire and the German Empire had engaged in a frantic naval arms race. They built massive battleships known as dreadnoughts, which were floating fortresses of steel and hydraulic power. Now the time for posturing was over, and the time for destruction had arrived. The fate of the war hung in the balance on these cold waters. If the German High Seas Fleet could crush the British Grand Fleet, the stranglehold of the blockade on Germany would be broken. If the British could destroy the German fleet, total dominance of the seas would be assured. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of empires and the outcome of the First World War. At the heart of this approaching cataclysm stood two men bearing the weight of nations on their shoulders. Admiral John Jellicoe commanded the British Grand Fleet with a calculating mind and a burden of immense responsibility. He was the only man on either side who could lose the war in a single afternoon. Opposing him was Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer of the German High Seas Fleet. Scheer was aggressive and determined to lure a portion of the British fleet into a trap. These two commanders were playing a high-stakes game of chess with thousands of lives and millions of tons of steel as their pieces. The question that haunted every sailor and strategist was simple yet terrifying. Could the vaunted Royal Navy maintain its centuries of dominance against the rising technological might of Germany? The British had the numbers, but the Germans had superior ship designs and arguably better gunnery. As the fleets drew closer through the mist, the world held its breath. Would the British repeat the glories of Trafalgar, or would the German Navy rewrite history? The answer lay hidden in the fog banks and beneath the rolling waves of the North Sea, where death awaited the careless and the brave alike. The initial contact was not a grand fleet action, but a savage brawl between the scouting forces. British Vice Admiral David Beatty led his Battlecruiser squadron forward to engage the German scouting group commanded by Vice Admiral Franz Hipper. The Battlecruisers were fast and heavily armed, but they sacrificed armor protection for speed. This design philosophy would soon prove to be a fatal flaw. As the great guns roared to life, the German gunnery proved deadly accurate. Shells plunged through the thin deck armor of the British ships, finding the volatile cordite magazines deep within their hulls. A catastrophic explosion suddenly tore the sky apart as the British battlecruiser Indefatigable was struck. A column of flame and smoke shot thousands of feet into the air as the massive ship disintegrated in seconds. More than 1,000 men vanished in an instant, leaving nothing but oil and debris on the surface. It was a shocking blow to the Royal Navy, which had prided itself on invincibility. But the horror was just beginning. Mere minutes later, the Queen Mary suffered a similar fate, detonating with such force that her hull was obliterated. The British were losing ships at an alarming rate. Beatty stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Lion, and watched his squadron burning around him. With a stoic expression that masked his internal turmoil, he remarked to his flag captain that there seemed to be something wrong with their bloody ships today. Despite the losses, Beatty did not turn back. He continued to engage the enemy, drawing the German battle cruisers south. He was the bait in a trap of his own making. He needed to lure Hipper and the main German fleet toward the massive guns of Jellicoe and the Grand Fleet, which were racing south to join the fight. Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer believed his plan was working perfectly. He thought he had caught a portion of the British fleet isolated and vulnerable. The German High Seas Fleet steamed north in full battle formation, ready to crush the remaining British battle cruisers. The German sailors were jubilant seeing the burning wrecks of their enemies. They believed the day was theirs. However, they were unaware that they were steaming directly into the jaws of the entire British Grand Fleet. The hunter was about to become the hunted in a dramatic reversal of fortune. As Beatty turned north, he led the unsuspecting Germans toward Jellicoe. This phase of the battle became known as the Run to the North. The German ships pursued aggressively, firing salvo after salvo. The sky was dark with smoke and the sea boiled with falling shells. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of explosions that rattled the teeth of every man on board. Inside the steel turrets, gun crews worked in sweltering heat, hoisting heavy shells and cordite charges. They were fueled by adrenaline and the primal instinct to kill before being killed. Admiral Jellicoe on the bridge of the Iron Duke received confused reports from his scouts. He needed to know the exact location and heading of the German fleet to deploy his ships effectively. A wrong decision could lead to disaster. The mist was thickening and visibility was dropping. Jellicoe peered into the gloom, waiting for the moment of truth. Finally, the shapes of the German fleet emerged from the haze. In a brilliant tactical maneuver, Jellicoe ordered his fleet to deploy into a single line of battle, crossing the path of the approaching Germans. This maneuver is known in naval warfare as crossing the T. It is the ultimate tactical advantage. It allowed every British battleship to bring all their guns to bear on the leading German ships, while the Germans could only fire their forward guns. The horizon erupted as the entire British line opened fire. The German flagship and leading vessels were hammered by a wall of steel. Water spouts from missed shells towered around them, while direct hits crumpled armor plate like paper. Scheer realized with horror that he had walked into a trap of immense proportions. The German fleet was now facing the full might of the Royal Navy. Scheer saw his lead ships taking heavy punishment. The Lutzow was burning and sinking. The Seydlitz was heavily damaged. Panic threatened to take hold, but Scheer kept his nerve. He ordered a complex and dangerous maneuver known as the battle turn away. Every German ship turned 180 degrees, simultaneously retreating into the mist. It was a desperate move, executed with precision, that saved his fleet from immediate annihilation. The firing died down as the Germans disappeared into the smoke. Jellicoe was wary of pursuing too closely. He feared German torpedoes and mines. He kept his fleet between the Germans and their home ports, hoping to catch them again. The game of cat and mouse continued in the fading light. Scheer, hoping to slip past the British, turned his fleet back east. In doing so, he inadvertently ran straight back into the center of the British line. For a second time, Jellicoe crossed the T of the German fleet. The British guns roared once more, punishing the German battleships with devastating accuracy. The German situation was critical. Their ships were battered and their crews were exhausted. To save his battleships, Scheer ordered his Battlecruisers to charge the British line in a death ride. This suicidal charge was intended to buy time for the main fleet to escape. The German Battlecruisers, already damaged, took a severe pounding, but they held their course. Their sacrifice allowed the rest of the high seas fleet to turn away and escape into the gathering darkness. The sun set on a scene of burning ships and churning waters. Night fell over the North Sea, bringing a new kind of terror. The organized lines of battle dissolved into a chaotic melee of confused actions. In the darkness, friend and foe were often indistinguishable until searchlights cut through the gloom. Then point-blank cannon fire and torpedoes would tear through steel. The British night fighting skills were not as refined as the Germans, and communications broke down. Massive shapes loomed out of the dark, fired their weapons, and vanished again. It was a nightmare of sudden flashes and screaming metal. One of the most tragic incidents of the night involved the British armored cruiser Black Prince. She stumbled upon the German battleship line in the dark. The Germans illuminated her with searchlights and unleashed a torrent of fire. The Black Prince was torn apart at close range and sank with all hands. There were no survivors. Throughout the night, destroyers launched torpedo attacks, hoping to strike a lucky blow against the Leviathans. The sea was lit by the fires of burning ships, creating a hellish reflection on the black water. Admiral Jellicoe tried to position his fleet to intercept the Germans at dawn. However, Scheer managed to navigate his fleet through the rear of the British formation. The Germans cut through the British destroyer screen in a series of violent skirmishes. By the time the sun rose on June 1st, the German high seas fleet had slipped through the net and was making its way back to the safety of the Jade estuary. The British were left in possession of an empty battlefield strewn with debris and bodies. The aftermath of the battle was a grim accounting of loss. The British had lost 3 battlecruisers, 3 armored cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Over 6,000 British sailors had perished. The Germans had lost 1 battlecruiser, 1 pre-dreadnought battleship, 4 light cruisers, and 5 torpedo boats. Their death toll was just over 2,500. Tactically, the Germans claimed a victory. They had sunk more tonnage and killed more men than the British. The German press hailed it as a great triumph. However, the strategic reality was far different. The British Grand Fleet was still ready for action the very next day. The German high seas fleet was heavily damaged and would not venture out in force again for the remainder of the war. The British blockade remained in place, choking the German economy and starving its people. The German attempt to break the British naval dominance had failed. The prisoner had assaulted the jailer but remained in his cell. The status quo of the war at sea had not changed. The loss of life was felt deeply in Britain. The invincible image of the Royal Navy had been tarnished. Questions were asked in Parliament and in the press about why the German fleet had not been annihilated. The design of the British ships and the safety procedures regarding cordite handling came under scrutiny. It was discovered that British crews often left flash doors open to increase the rate of fire, which allowed fires to flash down into the magazines, causing the catastrophic explosions. For the families of the fallen, the strategic nuances mattered little. Thousands of young men were gone, swallowed by the cold gray sea. The names of the ships like Invincible and Queen Mary became synonymous with tragedy. Memorials would be built and medals awarded, but the void left by the lost generation of sailors could never be filled. The Battle of Jutland became a somber chapter in the history of the Royal Navy, a victory won at a terrible cost. In Germany, the mood shifted from jubilation to realization. The Kaiser had celebrated the victory, but the admirals knew the truth. They could not win a conventional naval war against Britain. This realization led the German High Command to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in a desperate attempt to starve Britain into submission. This decision would ultimately bring the United States into the war, sealing the fate of the German Empire. The ripples of Jutland extended far beyond the North Sea. The controversy over the battle continued for decades. Supporters of Beatty argued that Jellicoe was too cautious and missed a chance for a decisive victory. Supporters of Jellicoe argued that his primary duty was to preserve the fleet and maintain the blockade, which he did. They pointed out that risking the fleet to torpedoes and mines would have been reckless. The debate between the two camps divided the Royal Navy for years. Both men had performed their duties according to their different temperaments and responsibilities. The wrecks of the great ships still lie on the floor of the North Sea today. They are war graves protected by international law. Divers who have visited the sites describe massive steel hulls twisted by the force of explosions and covered in marine life. They are silent monuments to the violence of that day. The guns that once shook the world are now silent, rusting in the darkness of the deep. They serve as a permanent reminder of the fury of the Great War. Technologically, the battle taught navies around the world valuable lessons. The importance of armor protection over speed was highlighted. Fire control systems and communication protocols were improved. The vulnerability of magazines to flash fires led to strict changes in ammunition handling. The era of the battle cruiser as a concept began to fade, replaced by the fast battleship, which combined speed with heavy armor. Jutland influenced naval design for the next 30 years, leading up to the Second World War. The human element of the battle is often overshadowed by the machines. But inside those steel beasts were men who showed incredible courage. Gun crews continued to fire while their ships burned around them. Signalmen stood on exposed bridges, sending messages amidst flying shrapnel. Engineers stayed at their posts in the bowels of sinking ships to keep the lights on for their shipmates. Their stories of bravery and sacrifice are the true legacy of Jutland. They did their duty in the face of overwhelming terror. One such story is that of boy First Class John Cornwell. He was just 16 years old, serving on the light cruiser Chester. Severely wounded and with his gun crew dead around him, he remained at his post awaiting orders. He died shortly after the battle and was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. His heroism became a symbol of the youthful sacrifice demanded by the war. He represented the thousands of ordinary sailors who performed extraordinary deeds. The strategic stalemate at sea meant that the war would be decided on the Western Front. The blockade continued to weaken Germany, causing food shortages and unrest. The German fleet remained a fleet in being a threat that tied down British resources but could not break the deadlock. The war of attrition continued grinding down the armies of Europe. Jutland was the climax of the naval war, but it did not bring the swift end to the conflict that many had hoped for. As we look back on the Battle of Jutland, we see a complex tapestry of courage, error, and chance. It was a collision of empires that resulted in a bloody draw. It demonstrated the limits of naval power and the horrific efficiency of modern weaponry. The image of the great dreadnought steaming into battle remains one of the most enduring symbols of World War I. It was the last time in history that battleships would dominate the oceans in such a grand manner. The age of the dreadnought would eventually pass, replaced by the aircraft carrier and the submarine. But for one afternoon in 1916, the battleship was the undisputed king of the sea. The sheer scale of the engagement has never been equaled. The thunder of the guns at Jutland echoed the end of an era. It was the twilight of the old world order sinking beneath the waves, along with the ships and men who fought to preserve it. In the end, the Battle of Jutland asks us to consider the cost of war. Was the strategic victory worth the loss of so many lives? Could the outcome have been different if commanders had made other choices? History offers no easy answers, only the cold facts of what transpired. The North Sea keeps its secrets, and the dead rest in their watery graves. We are left to study the charts and the logs, trying to understand the magnitude of the event. The legacy of Jutland is not just in the history books, but in the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. It ensured that Britain remained the dominant naval power, allowing the Allies to eventually win the war. It forced Germany into a strategy that brought America into the conflict. In this sense, the stalemate at Jutland was a pivot point in history. A different outcome could have resulted in a German victory in the war and a vastly different world today. We remember the Battle of Jutland not to glorify war, but to honor those who fought. We remember the fear and the adrenaline, the smoke and the fire. We remember the sailors who never returned home. Their sacrifice reminds us of the fragility of peace and the terrible price of conflict. As the years pass, the memory of the battle fades, but the lessons remain relevant. The sea is a cruel mistress, and war is a relentless devourer of life. The whispers of time carry the voices of the past. They tell us of a day when the sea burned and the sky fell. They speak of Jellicoe and Scheer, of Beatty and Hipper. They tell of the Indefatigable and the Queen Mary. As long as we listen, their stories will not be lost. The Battle of Jutland stands as a monument to human ambition and folly, a testament to the courage of men and the power of machines. So when you look out over the gray waters of the North Sea, imagine the ghosts of the dreadnoughts. Imagine the roar of the guns and the cries of the men. Remember the largest naval battle of the First World War. Remember the costly stalemate that shaped the future. The Battle of Jutland is history etched in steel and blood, a story that will endure as long as the tides rise and fall.